Hi, I'm Kyla Sommers, a PhD student at George Washington University, and I'm interviewing Dr. Tommy Curry, a professor of philosophy at Texas A&M University. To start off, Dr. Curry, given your background in philosophy and ethical studies, what issues do you see as being raised by the topic that students will grapple with during the debates?
I think there's a few topics that are going to be grappled with. I think there's going to be ethical questions involving the specific literature of whether or not microbial life has intrinsic or instrumental value. I also think that there's going to be issues concerning how we come to think about the process of discovery, larger questions of colonization, be they methodological or historical, given what we know the history of colonization on Earth is. And then I think there are more conceptual problems of how we think of Martians or microbial life on Mars in relation to larger human problems that we have in this country or even on Earth in general. In other words, do we value the human over the microbe the same way that we have arguments over valuing the human over animal life on Earth? So I think these are three broad areas that will be involved in questioning whether or not we have an unrelenting ethical obligation to microbial life.
Okay, great. What do you think of those three areas will be the most difficult or perhaps the most contentious to grapple with?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, when you're dealing with ethical problems, or even in the area that I work in, which is anti-humanism and anti-ethics, I think you're constantly going to run into the problem of what is more important. So on the one hand, you have this kind of conceptual argument of how you assign value. This is Charles Cockle's work, right? Of how is there instrumental value, meaning that we know that microbial life or microorganisms are important because we have uses for them on Earth. So can we kind of extend by analogy that micro organisms on Mars will have similar value or the same value? There's a question of whether or not we understand it as indigenous life, worthy of preservation and protection. And of course, there's issues of, kind of ethical principles of whether or not it has intrinsic value. I think that all those are routinely traditional ethical concerns that we have, but I think that sometimes they miss the point. So the question really becomes not whether or not what value we assign to microorganisms or microbial life. The question is, do we have the right to assign value to these entities? And I think that that's the most difficult question because it becomes a meta-ethical question or a question about how we formulate ethics in the first place. Some people also refer to this as kind of a philosophical anthropology. What is the capacity of the human or the subject that you're using to do the action to actually construct rational and reasonable and just ends in our views of ethics? And I think that's probably the most difficult question because I think it takes us out of the routine comfort zones of does something have value or does it not have value. It takes us into a realm of whether or not we have the capacity to accurately or even justly or rationally assign value to something that we see as external to something that is non-human.
Absolutely. That's definitely an interesting way of thinking about it. So I guess to move on from kind of the abstract of what we'll be dealing with to more, your specific expertise and what you know that others have written as well as yourself, what are your views on the
I think I lost you for a second. Your screen froze. Yeah, I got you back.
Oh, sorry, now my mic was, I'm sorry, my mic was muted. Did you hear the question?
I did not. I'm sorry.
No, you didn't. Okay. The question was, what are your views on if microbial life has any moral standing or not?
That's a great question. I've been thinking about this for a few weeks, given the interview. I think it's complicated. Let me phrase what my worry is. I think that some of the arguments made by Carl Sagan and Carl Lupacella, I think some of their work is really interesting on this question. I am My concern is kind of twofold. One, is there a process of colonization whereby the United States or other Earthlings set up a colony or a place where microbial life on Mars or elsewhere simply becomes a fountain for their own uses. In other words, we assign value to it insofar as we find it useful for human existence, our discovery, or progress. And I think that what comes along with that isn't just physical occupation, but also the question of an epistemic or a methodological colonization. And what I mean by that is, do we only know microbial life on Mars insofar as it extends the kind of taxonomies we have to know about nature here on Earth? In other words, we've set up a cultural or philosophical view that places the human as the discoverer, a rational animal that seeks to go out, discover, colonize, name, and categorize nature. And nature in many ways becomes oppositional to that. So it's external to the human. It's something that the human has power to act upon. And I think that when we think of that relationship, how we name something, describe something, and assign value to it, this is the part of epistemology, how we then come to know these other aspects of nature that we had no previous knowledge of before. But part of that, there's really good work that Lewis Gordon does on epistemic colonization, but part of that isn't just the description, but it's the process. So do we somehow now describe microbial life on Mars as something that is inferior to the human because we have ordered society, we've ordered nature in such a way that the human becomes the origin of all taxonomy and definition, and everything else simply passively receives it? Now, this ordering of nature, this order of being, is a serious consideration. And my fear is that when we make arguments or ask questions about how do we assign value or do they have value, then what we're really doing is extending our definitions from Earth onto Mars, as if those things are naturally assumed to be true. In other words, in fact, what we're doing is we're suggesting that microbial life on Mars is merely an extension of what we know the universe and nature is. So it doesn't require any kind of external or new critical ways to investigate our relationship to nature itself. Given that, given that explanation, I think that when we ask ourselves, does microorganisms on Mars have value? What we're in fact trying to ask ourselves is, can we ever know of the value that microorganisms would have in such a way that we have duties or obligations to them? My view generally in these kinds of ethical questions, because I don't think that we should epistemically colonize or epistemically converge anything, make them fit into kind of our schemas and order relations. I don't think that we should be making those kind of designations, because those designations always require that we have some superior order and some inferior order. So what I would be more interested in is suggesting that, given that we can't accurately ascertain the value that these organisms have in relation to the human, then it means that the human has to suspend their ability to claim that they've discovered it. That we can make note of it, we can describe it, but we can't give a value to it so that the value stands in relationship to, say, how we look at dogs, cats, other animals, and the human, right? We should resist putting it within our schema, of a rational order. So the question really isn't, does it have value? The question would be, yes, it exists. Insofar as we know by analogy, we can say that it has a will to live, that these organisms are thriving, are existing, or perhaps they're maybe they're dying. But all of that should be beyond human cognition, except for the description of it, in my view.
So you mentioned that there's a lot of other ethicists have discussed the ways that we try and establish ethical values and categories. Do they often use a comparison to events historically on Earth? Yes. And how that has played out in terms of making hierarchies? And do you think that any of those have a particular to this topic?
I think so. I mean, I think that's Sagan's point, that we've done such a horrible job with the environment on Earth that we certainly don't want to do that on Mars. I think even Caldwell's piece talks about the relationship between planetary protection versus planetary preservation. Is this a situation where, we simply aim to not contaminate or endanger indigenous life on Mars, or are we trying to enhance it, right? So I think all those models can be used to come to ethical decisions, right? We can say, here's something that we can call ethical given what we're trying to do on Earth. The problem is the reason that we have the problems we have on Earth is because we've created relationships with the economy, relationships with how we evaluate the subject or the human and then the non-human, the way that we view nature as something that's inanimate versus not living, right? I mean, think about it. If we look at indigenous cultures of North America or African cultures or even Asian cultures, the relationship the human has with nature is not innate, it's not already given, right? It's they have different views. They think that the human, rather than being kind of a biological fixity outside of nature, right, is actually within nature. You know, you have indigenous people that think animals are people. You know, you have different spiritual qualities. So all these different cosmologies suggest that the relationships that we have with nature would be vastly different if we model it off of Western epistemology or Western anthropology. Given that truth, then it says, well, sure, we have all these problems on Earth, but do these problems originate because of necessity? Because any economic system, any industrial system would do this to the planet? Or do these things originate because we have a human-centric view that views capitalism as a rational economic system, profit as a neoliberal and self-interested rational endeavor, and the consequences to nature to be something that we simply don't care about because it's fundamentally external to how humans on this planet, or a particular cultural notion of humanity exists on this planet? If we look at those things, right, not just looking at the effects of human action, but the kind of ideological or hierarchical rubrics that necessitate or rationalize the effects of those actions, then I think we get into a situation where we can see, well, look, you know, if we actually cared about the environment on Earth, if we adopted a different cosmology of the environment on Earth, then the ethical effects and questions would be vastly different. So that's kind of the need for, you know, a teleological suspension, so to speak, a suspension of how we think we should engage simply with Mars as a function of nature or as an example of nature that we can just extend our earthly or already human-centric views up on. I think that in order for us to actually get to the root of what's happening on Earth, we have to look at the causalities, like what has modernity done such that the introduction of the rational human being has allowed us to do things like capitalism and corporatism and globalization that's had these kinds of effects on the planet. And then do we use that model when we're trying to engage microbial life on Mars? Do we look at it as only a resource for discovery? Do we only look at it as a resource for how we understand human life? I mean, think about the self-interestedness there, that we've discovered new life, but we're only interested in so far as it clarifies our origins, right? Now, there's something to be said about knowledge for knowledge's sake, but does that knowledge then produce or offer us a respect of what is discovered in nature? Or does that knowledge create ethical systems that allow us to rationalize the use, exploitation, and in many ways, degradation of what we see microorganisms as on Mars? So I think it's a very complicated problem that requires us to look more into how we evaluate the relationship of the human to nature and the relationship of knowledge in trying to rationalize those kinds of products. There's nothing that says that we have to utilize microbial life for our own needs. We just presuppose it as the basis of science. There's nothing that says that scientific discovery has to come at the cost of another life or of other entities. We simply presuppose it, right? And that's what I mean when I say we uncritically extend what we take to be scientific fixities and the relation of the human to nature upon every discovery, even when it's something like another planet.
So I think the next question really addresses what you've just spoken to, but maybe you would want to reframe just in the context of a specific question. So here, the question is, if it does, if microbial life does have moral standing, which I think you just spoke to, how should we assess a conflict between the needs of human life and extraterrestrial microbial life?
Right. And see, this is that hierarchy word of being I was saying, right? You know, this is the problem. Well, let me say this is what I think is the general problem that's unannounced with ethical systems, right? It requires an ordering. So in order for us to answer that question, we have to decide what is the value of extraterrestrial life and what's the value of human life, such that we can make a utilitarian calculus of which one is worth more and which one would we value in conflict. How do we do that? I know how people do it, but how do we earnestly do it? Do we just pick a number? Do we just suggest that because it's microbes and not human, that the non-human is less than the human? See, these are the concepts of Western man that someone like Sylvia Winters is concerned with. If we think of the human as a biological apex, as something that comes at the very height of evolution and the height of civilization that is worth the most, then what we overlook is that that notion is not given in nature, but is in fact culturally constructed. It's something that is the product not of what we take to be biology, but what biology, what religion, what economics has all given us culturally to assume about the position of the human in relationship to nature. So to ask that question means that we have to kind of work backwards to say, why do we place the human, the specific rational and economic concept of the human, above what we take to be the lower life forms of life? And I think that if we're going to say, well, how do we value the two? Then the question becomes, why are we in contact with such life on another planet that creates the conflict in the first place? In other words, we've engaged them in a situation where we're the visitor. In many ways, we're the colonizer. So how do we think of the relationship that our life has now on a completely different planet, on a completely different geography? You know, this is where Fanon's work really does resonate, is that what then is the value of the colonizer, so to speak, such that you can negate the native and you're the one that artificially inserted yourself as the foreigner. So the conflict emerges because we've put ourselves in that kind of situation. And I think that if we're looking at it from a decolonial or anti-humanist stance where we don't prioritize the human, then we could suggest something like microbicobial life is simply worth more than human life, because we don't have any reason to believe that humans should naturally take up the chain of being in this other planetary context. I also think that one of the risks of this is that it assumes that the modalities and hierarchies that we have on Earth should simply be analogously placed on life on Mars. And what's the reasoning for that? Is the reason because we haven't found any intelligent or human-like intelligence or being on Mars that can resist our schema, that we should simply impose ours? Or is it the case that we simply believe that ours is the extension of the natural laws of the universe and that it holds in all cases? I think in the first case that we shouldn't have to require intelligent life to simply not impose our view. If we recognize that the human is a cultural construction, then that means that there's also limits to how far that notion can go. And in the latter view, I think there's a question of why we believe that discovery necessitates universality, that we can discover something and still have an incomplete view of its ontology, its fundamental being and origin, or even how we think that we should use it. In other words, the notions that we have of discovery could simply be wrong because we don't know what we're categorizing or the actual meaning that of what we've discovered has in its own planetary context. So I think that those are the types of things that would kind of push us away from asking that ethical question and already resolve it for us. It just suggests that we have no ethical basis unless we erroneously assume the priority of the human over other life forms to adequately assign value to human life over other life on different planets. There you go.
I guess my final question is well, perhaps not final, but do you think that you've talked a lot about Western constructs of ethics, Western constructs of hierarchies. Do you see this system of thinking as pervasive throughout the world? Or do you think that it could depend, the way that we interact with whatever microbial life was discovered could depend on which part of the world discovered it first and how that initial contact?
That's a very good question. I think it depends. I think it depends. Unfortunately, the way that we look at science, reason, the very process of scientific discovery. I mean, you know, this is Kuhn's work, the social construction of scientific revolutions. I mean, I think that we have to understand that there's a cultural contingency there. The question becomes, who's been acculturated into that? Is the scientific method that we see coming from the West, from Europe, from the Enlightenment, really a product of both the culture and the discipline of astrobiology, for instance? We'd actually have to kind of study the discipline to see what the core assumptions of it are, which I think would be a great way to approach the topic of what does astrobiology presuppose about the nature of biology on other on other planets. But I think that if you're looking at different cultures or different cosmologies that may be involved in how we look at astrobiology or life on other planets, then there's a way for us to get a little closer to decolonizing, or at least contextualizing the kinds of ethical questions that we're going to ask. Remember, ethics is not a universal question. It's a universal question based on certain contingent assumptions about relationships of rational human beings. So this is why it becomes so messy when you say, well, what is the human's obligation to the disabled person? What is the rational person's obligation to the non-rational person? Notice how that's a difference of kind, because now you're saying that there's more obligations to different kinds of people. Whereas when you think of reason generally, or ethics generally, you're saying, well, then what should two rational beings decide given the same conditions or given the same conflicts? I think that the issue with Mars gets to this meta-ethical question of this other kind of being. And if we're going to seriously engage that question, then we have to say, okay, well, are there other cultural constructs that we have here on Earth that would get us a little closer to understanding the relationality of life than the way that we look at kind of the intrinsic or instrumental values that are generally so prevalent in Western metaphysics and ethics? You know, so yeah, I mean, hypothetically speaking, we could think of someone in Africa or Asia or South America, or people that have different groups of people that we know have different relationships to nature and discovery outside of the West, that may very well have a very different account of how we should engage with microbial life on Mars, simply based on their cosmological views of how they relate to nature and to the larger order of the universe. But we don't know. I mean, the spread of scientific knowledge, of economics, globalization, has in many ways done the job of socializing many disciplines, universities, and especially these kind of, space explorations towards this view of who gets there first, what resources will be discovered, what ways can we use the knowledge or the life that we've discovered on these other planets. So there is a very real neoliberal model, even in the idea that we should, explore planets outside of Earth. Can we solve that problem? I don't know, because this is a problem of knowledge. This is a problem of how we think about the categories we use for ethical deliberation. How do we weigh what we on Earth? Microbes are, they're amongst the lowest, right? They're at the food chain level, right? So if we just make that analogous to how we think of them on Mars, then we may miss the point. I mean, what if that is the only life on Mars? Then we're functionally dehumanizing it. Insofar as it's the devaluation would be literally saying that the Martian life doesn't matter because it's not at a stage where we believe is equal to the human. And these are real problems. These are real problems of reasoning because we're making ethical decisions based on analogy. Quine makes this argument in the indeterminacy of translation. It says that, despite us pointing to the same object, like, we think of an animal as a rabbit, and they think another group of people think of it as a gabagai. He says, well, we could point to the same object, but the question is, do we understand the full relations and significance? Because gabagai could not just be what we call the rabbit, but the grass or the environment or literally the space or spirituality that the gabagai, occupies. And we don't even perceive that because we just see rabbit. We just look at the furry animal. So is it the same thing with the microbe? Do we only see what's our science is designated as that microbe, that organism, when in reality it has a very different meaning within the complexities? Or I mean, what if it's the beginning of an evolutionary chain? What if our interruption in fact destroys the possibility of a civilization millennia from now? Like, these are the ethical questions that we can't ascertain if we take a human-centric view or a biocentric view of the human. Because it eliminates the possibility of actualizing things beyond our own conceptualization of our use and our reason. And I think that these are more difficult questions than does something have value or not have value. But I think that it's questions that require us to kind of push the cosmological boundaries of what we think Western science and Western epistemology, or even the epistemology of capitalist countries like America or Europe or Russia, right, who've pushed space exploration in the past. So I think all these things have to be looked at in terms of how empirical conditions like economic growth, profit, the push for resources, the notoriety for discovery, being the first person to do something, next to the overall picture of, can we really say that the universe moves around human understanding? Or does human understanding merely impede the larger motion of the universe? We're only a blip, in reality, and our ethical systems really only apply to what we think about, and not the overall constructs of the problems that have existed since the beginning of time that we're trying to deal with. So I think we have to have that kind of critical view. We have to take a pensive and somewhat meta-ethical view of how we want to engage the topic.
So on Monday, the news came out that Mars had,
Yes.
scientists had discovered water on Mars. And you talked a lot about the way that you set up hierarchies of, we think that microbes are just at the bottom of the food chain, and also the ways that we just assume that things are for our benefit as humans. Did you see a lot of those themes in the press releases or the discussions about the discovery of water on Mars?
I did. I saw a few that spoke, that was some word about contamination. Right? What harm would we do through it was cross-planetary contamination, which I thought was a pretty cool term. I saw some of that, and some people, argued similar to the point that I was making about how do we affect it and the possible growth or evolution of this life. So I think that people are having the conversation. The problem is I don't think that we have frames to resolve it. And that's what I mean, that on the one hand, we could honestly ask the question, should we contaminate? Should we preserve? Should we protect? What happens if we do, right? And we're going to look at that from our vantage point. But the other part about it is, what are the other kind of frames, epistemological frames that we have to rationalize microbes outside of how we think of microorganisms on Earth? And that's what hasn't been explored. All the literature from Lupesi to Sagan to, Cockle are making very clear distinctions about our effects and consequences on microbes. Do they have value? Do they not have value? How does our presence affect them? But the other question is, if we don't know what they are and the relationship they play on their own planet, only insofar as we see it, right? So it's just like, as an individual seeing you, I don't know your inner workings. I don't know your psychology. I don't know your personality. I don't know what your aspirations are. If we can't assign those things or know of those things for the Martian life, then how do we accurately capture what they mean? We just know them by designation. And I think that that's part of the excitement, and also part of the trepidation that I saw when they discovered water on Mars. Because there's a fundamental question, like, this is exciting. What does it mean? Right now we know that we see microbial life. Yes, we're there. But on the other hand, there's a question of, well, how do we engage it? Like, is the water on Mars a resource? Is there water on Mars something that's going to justify us drilling beneath the surface to find out where it comes from? Is this water on Mars looked at as is it inevitably going to be venture capitalism? Right? Notice how the discovery is connected to all of the taxonomies that we have on Earth, because this is how we operate. So yeah, I saw a little bit of it. I think that the question of contamination is very important if we're trying to respect the life of Martians. But then again, the best thing that I think we can do is suggest that it has value, that we can't place that value in our schema and then just stop right there. Let's not try to rationalize it beyond why we should or shouldn't engage it. Let's say, okay, we found this, that there's possibility for more discovery, but let's not try to put this in kind of a modality or hierarchy where we think we could then rationalize our engagements to it. And I think that that's going to be one of the most challenging parts of the topic, is that many people, many students are going to assume that the best way for us to engage the topic is to argue yes or no, right? Do we have this this overriding moral ethical obligation, or do we not have it? But the fundamental question is, in either case, why do we assume that we're the ones to decide it? That's the supposition of modern ethics, that you have to assume the rational human. You have to assume an economic self-interested human. This is just what our cultural baggage has given us. So, whether or not we do good or bad, inevitably it's probably going to be bad, but whether or not we do good or bad kind of has to come as a secondary question, maybe a tertiary question to the foundational question of how do we see ourselves relating within order to Martian life.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much. This has definitely given everyone a lot of things to think about, and we really thank you for your time.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a great day.
All right. Bye-bye.